We're going to move on to the enlightenment, as it's sometimes called, the age of reason. I'm just going to burn through some of the most important features just so that instead of giving a whole pile of information, I can just touch on some important points. I don't know how much of this I'm going to need my students to review, but I'm just going to go ahead. So, the Enlightenment emerged out of the Renaissance. 1687 was, what's it called? Isaac Newton's something Mathematica. Newton's Principia Mathematica. I didn't even try to make that sound pronounced properly. So that's sometimes considered the first major scholarly work or scientific work of the Enlightenment. The French date the Enlightenment from the death of Louis XIV. That's so bad. I'll just say Louis XIV. And the end of the Enlightenment was the beginning of the French Revolution. So we're talking about, okay, so for the French, the Enlightenment is 1715 to 1789. It usually means something much broader than that, but those are good historical markers, at least within France. So death of Louis XIV in 1715 to the French Revolution in 1789. 1789 is an interesting year for art history. If you want to familiarize yourself with the end of Enlightenment and the movement into modernism, just look up the year 1789 and review what was going on in Europe. I'm not going to do it for you. So generally speaking, sorry, I had to turn the volume down on the mic, so hopefully that first part isn't too loud. Most people end the Enlightenment at the beginning of the 19th century. And what can we say about the Enlightenment? There was a lot of meeting of minds. There was this idea that we could all put our heads together, the best and the brightest among us, using rationality and science. We could kind of figure reality out, figure out how to make the ideal state, the ideal government, philosophy, etc. So there was scientific academies and, lodges like the Freemasons, coffee houses and literary salons. There's a great book called The Moon and Sixpence, which is kind of roughly based on the life of Gauguin. It's a fantastic novel about Moon and Sixpence is set in the 19th century, but it gives you an idea of this kind of artists and poets and writers, and they're kind of, there was the highbrow salons, and then there was the coffee houses, which is more for like the poor or the kind of, the fringes of the cultural and artistic movements. Anyways, there's lots of actually Somerset Maugham books that give an excellent idea of this kind of cultural, intellectual, literary circles. Of course, Maugham set in the very late 19th, early 20th century and all that. Well, some of it's earlier, but we're talking about the 18th century. So it started to be sort of, well, something like journalism and periodicals, so pamphlets and mass political movements and things like that. See, this is part of how we ended up with the French Revolution. And there was lots of popularization of communism and lots of things, atheism, and so a whole bunch of 19th century movements like liberalism. Sorry, I'm really tired. I have to shoot this late at night because for like 12 hours a day, right outside this window here, they're digging up the street, and they have this giant jackhammer that's on a front end loader. And yeah, it's all bang, bang, bang and rattling all day. So that's why I'm doing this in the wee hours, which is why the lighting looks weird and why my eyes look so tired. Anyways, what was I saying? So these Enlightenment ideas gave birth to the political revolutions, most famously the French Revolution, and a kind of, well, a big part of the project was that rationality, science, and intellectuals could replace the church and the aristocracy and the monarchies, etc., etc. So let's just boil it down to something a bit oversimplified, but I think it'll help give context. Science really came into its own, and that Isaac Newton publication is a good symbol of that. And there was this idea that intellectuals, artists, philosophers, poets, what have you, political philosophers, could think up something, quote unquote, real to replace all the old, traditions, fairy tales, a very cynical view of traditional values. Science came into its own in the 18th century. And if you think about it, scientific discoveries that might start to explain, what is light, what is air, what is the atmosphere, what is beyond our planet, what is the planets and the stars, and the kind of, I mentioned before about throwing the baby out with the bathwater when all of the rigid traditions of visual art of the 18th and earlier centuries were discarded in the 19th century. The same sort of thing happened, I think, in the Enlightenment, where you look up at the stars, for example, and you start to be able to discover all the astronomical explanations for, how the stars and the planets and the sun move through the sky. And then you say, oh, well, it's not like Saturn's up there, or, the constellations in the sky. They're all just balls of gas, and there isn't this kind of metaphysical or mythological substructure beneath reality. But of course, the human psyche and the human imagination has found all kinds of extraordinary ways to explain very deep and profound truths. And science is just one angle to look at reality from. if you discard all the mythological, all the metaphysical, all the religious, and just say, okay, just with our rational minds, we can figure out how to live and how to be, how to build a perfect state. Well, you see what happens with liberalism and neoclassicism. For example, you end up with the French Revolution, which was a horrible mess, and the aristocracy was replaced with something just as bad or worse. And, again, you see in the 19th century with the flowering of communism that you have these utopian ideas that we can discard all the ideas of the past and we can replace them with something new, something that ignores the metaphysics of the past. And then what happens? Well, what happens is you have tens of millions of people die. And the same with like eugenics and this kind of one-dimensional approach of looking at race or nationality or whatever through the prism of rationality as a way to explain what is your nation's purpose, what is its destination, and then you end up with these crazy utopias, ideas of master races and all this horror we saw in the 20th century. So perhaps visual art, perhaps we can apply some of the lessons of the political and philosophical failures of the 19th and 20th century to visual art. So let's move on then. So we're by and large gotten rid of, by the French Revolution and the end of the Enlightenment. The fruit of the Enlightenment was, you could say, a major downgrading of the power, the reach, and the control of the monarchies, the churches, and these traditional power structures. The Enlightenment included a whole range of ideas that placed reason and scientific evidence at the center. So this sovereignty of reason, evidence of the senses, you can see the world of the five senses, as Blake called it, as primary sources of knowledge. And these kind of ideas came into fashion like liberty, progress, tolerance, brotherhood, fraternité. I don't even know how to pronounce that. I should just give up trying to pronounce French and Italian. Separation of church and state, constitutional government. Yeah, some of this Enlightenment thinking took shape in the American Constitution, which was brilliant and, planted the seeds that ended up with the abolition of slavery. And a lot of extraordinary people in the 19th and the 20th century, like Henry David Thoreau and Martin Luther King. But yeah, lots of nasty stuff too, like Nazism and communism.